The Conduit, Chapter 1. It began below the surface, a most insidious influx, subliminal to the extent that the exact onset cannot be pinpointed in retrospect, but of molten temblor, thus that once the threshold of awareness was to be breached, it had grown vast, monstrous, and malignant in import. The influence was that of a warping one, that sort of tide beneath the consciousness which modifies along its path, modulating and mutating the informational constructs it encounters, until the travesty earns the focal point of the highest awareness to recognize it for the torrential tear, and extirpate the modifier at its source. This, however, is easier to orchestrate than carry out, and all too often the intruder slips away from the weakened grasp of the dreamer before the vice-like grip of lucid godhood can manifest its purpose. It was for me this way, and with a start I awoke, to rifle mentally through what seemed to be the most recent events of the slumber, to ascertain the identity of the disquiet, to puzzle at the way the form shifted in countenance between that which was just prior experienced and the present remembrance of fact. It was just that disparity which ushered in a sense of cosmic unease, as if reaching out through that void to perturb the awareness, as the transformation of these forms flashed through the mind's eye, again and again, all while my corporeal husk remained static upon the bedspread, remanded from the proper day's beginnings by the repeated recollections and continuous related processings. After an arbitrary subjective duration had elapsed, the outcome of the cognitions was assembled to be that within my nocturnal reverie, the thematic content of which was generally mundane, although of exceptional timescale, the two characters who took up parts in the narrative reflected an alternate appearance once reconsidered by the waking mind, making out undeniably demonic visages layered within the latent information lurking just below the privy of the innocent dreamer. The horror of this realization was immense upon the consciousness, for to have realized the perilous nature of one's situation only after the fact provides a nasty shock, as many can attest, dulled only by the surge of relief which accompanies it, by way of the knowledge that the threatening presence has passed. To recognize this in dream, however, elevates the notion of latent terror, as even in waking, one is never wholly decoupled from the actions and influences of the unconsciousness, and if that realm of the internal is under duress, to duress the awakened will return, upon the inexorable diminishment of one's energies by the labors of the tumultuous day. Often a child or other mental inferior can be calmed following such an event, reassured simply by conceptions that there exists some illusory rift between the projections of the night and that of the waking day. Bah! A learned man cannot allow himself to take comfort in this notion, as to do so would be to deny the fundamental continuity of experience, which flows so seamlessly between the realms, and to omit an understanding of the inherent overlap of influence between the states would be equally foolhardy. It was only by the burgeoning of the modules which govern the basal metabolic functions of the bodily form as it prepares for the ritual of toil that the mind was dragged away from additional pondering of the torpid menace and into the further solidified horrors which are organized to befall the day laborer with the utmost of certainty. Much akin to diverting the sensory input of greater pain through the manual prescription of lesser agony, it is by the routine battering of one's vocation that the common man is kept in line, kept apart by that burden from potential realizations which could be birthed in tranquil depth, of both the exquisite beauty available through contemplation and direct awareness pertaining to the existence of abstracted horrors beyond common conception. Through these bars, man is protected from unshackled notions which lurk beyond the bounds of function within systems designed for production. Such were my thoughts as the routine machinery of the hands systematically delivered a multitude scooping of cereal from the cold depths of the milk bowl into the gullet. As I prepared further for that role relating to resource acquisition, gathering up the boots, coat, and additional materials, in order to brave the frigid passage separating the domicile from that aforementioned labor camp, it was the musing of the mind that each person has their greed, that unique manifestation of demand which outstrips all others, a particular element of exceeding interest, dedication, and attempted exploitation, by contrast to the lot of that element allocated to one's existence. Further meditation upon this proposed notion by the inner voice resulted in an inward angling of the finger that points, while the physical body engaged in the ageless contest of the heavy door pressed against the winds, and moved further on to outwit the treacherous cobblestones which composed the entryway, now slick with a murderous sheen of frozen dew. The boots met with the visual safety of the flattened sidewalk, promising by its architecture a period of stable and predictable traversion. Thus the narrative struck again, with the resources pertaining to navigation now freed up to be dedicated towards more abstract obstacles encountered in the business of living. In what form was that of my own avarice? Some disproportionate historical fixation? It did not take many steps to reason, nor any inordinate dredging of the swamp of memories to determine. An abrupt blast of winter breeze immediately sent thoughts adrift from the subject, the gale forcing an immediate return of attention to the business of maintaining a foothold upon the environment. Following the survival of several additional assaults of the type, cognition was steered towards the significance of the immediate sensory inputs coming in from the surrounding landscape. This included the tactile sensation of foot travel, which I found mechanically satisfying to enact, and most agreeable by way of how it jogged the mind into action, in contrast to the lethargic stasis inherent to prone contemplation. Additional bodily feeling related to the gales themselves, as the icy waves crashed, constituting in turn recall of so many situations of the sort encountered before. A bare survival mechanism it was to bring into awareness the sets of previous cognitions formulated for effectively navigating such scenarios, but the sentimental effect brought on by the multitude of overlapping memory triggers was of such great magnitude that one could not help attributing greater significance to the process. The input selection also included, stemming from the visual sector, a display of the actions of wildlife, particularly the affiliated groupings of birds which dotted the landscape, ballers working in teams to cement their survival against the fundamental frost. In addition to this primary objective relating to necessity, I wondered, did these avians, as individuals, contain secondary drives of the specific veracity which man does? Could these simple, mechanistic creatures even support such notions within the range of complexity by which their mind's design was constituted? My own scholarly knowledge of memory systems unsubstantiated the possibility, as it was unlikely that creatures with deficient narrative constructs of self could generate anything greater than an incidental fixation within their information processing functions. This likelihood, in turn, spawned the notion within my own mind that perhaps that sort of defect could account for one's own avaricious eccentricity as well. It was a suggestion greatly disturbing to a creature which believes itself esteemed in character and gifted of elevated cortical complexity. Thus I chose to temporarily dismiss the incidental explanation in the search of proof for a more exciting theory, like any enterprising researcher does when confronted with an outcome scarcely worth putting to paper. It was from between the clouds of these thoughts that the dawn of arrival upon the campus dawned upon me. The lower appendages had clearly gone to great work while the awareness had been suspended in sustained contemplation of the capacity for avian cognition, and now great structures of once red brick surrounded my position, threatening to blot out the massed but still blinding winter sun with their grand forms, bound in frozen, undecaying contraptions of vines. It was in this place, this setting of historic masonry, that my academic interest had been instilled, cultivated, and nearly tenured all those years ago now. The place responsible for both that very scholarly knowledge of memory and the immensity of urges to contemplate nearly anything beyond the immediate, as to be nearly tenured but not at one's dedicated and highly invested vocation, is a position of immense uncertainty regarding the stability of future prospects, and gives rise continuously to a multitude of qualms pertaining to the matter of economic survival, which must be routinely stifled. While that occupational security so desired was not the ultimate object of personal fixation, it remained a target of singular lust, tantalizing with the promise of material tranquility brought about by sustained income. To soon be at peace, that was the delusion. Having remained in motion while thoughts pertaining to circumstance transpired, it had come to be that the structure which was to be my captor for the duration of the workday loomed overhead, with its skewed roof of precisely articulated slabs, a multitude of entrances spanning the lower level from all traditionally possible sides of a rectangular building, and a stature of nearly 50 feet in height, generated by 3 stacked stories of classrooms, each allocating voluminous ceiling height for both the comfort of the students and to suggest the presence of importance that a grand room exerts. As I began to saunter within, towards the maze of corridors, the expected conjectures which precede a day of lecturing were blown away by a sudden, blazing recollection. Those underlying demoniac caricatures of the previous night's roving, how had they intruded upon the relative tranquility of my own mind, and from what realm, internal or not? It was only just after the day's toil had been dispatched that a framework regarding the pieces at play had begun to take shape in totality. The fundamental component of this theory was, as follows, that an interior as opposed to exterior origin of the phenomenon was immaterial for addressing the matter in practice. Between delivering sessions of lecture on the tangentially related topics of mind, its roots in matter, and the organization of the materials necessary to facilitate the emergent function of mental faculty, I had begun to formulate notions of a test to discern whether the intrusive presence was derived from some rogue inner component of my own mental machinery, or of a truly novel incision within the system. By mid-afternoon, whence a bit more thinking time was allocated into the schedule, these prospects had begun to grow cold and been dismissed, for it seemed incongruous with known reason to assume one's own mind able to correlate its contents to the extent necessary to determine an outside presence of any sort, given the nature of the divide of the conditionally obscured unconsciousness and the mind's all-encompassing role in the generation of the subjective reality experience itself. Therefore, the next viable process was to attempt a less technical, more intrinsic sort of delving. After all, if the mind was responsible for conjuring the correlates of all types, within and out, it should make little difference from what position the journey of inquisition is set out from. The logic compiled was as follows. Regardless of the origin point of the disturbance, the assumed endpoint resulted in an influx of information upon the conscious awareness. Within the organic substrate of the function understood as the mind, the brain, my scientific training suggested that information travels by way of a network of connections. These connections, understood to be semantic associations within the mind, mapped upon the neuronal circuitry of the brain in a manner which ostensibly encodes the information by transformation of the synapses, facilitates the mechanical journey of thoughts as encoded concepts reach out to one another, metaphorically akin to a hyper-intricate network of tunnels connected to the ingrained caverns of concepts. Utilizing this principle, through cultivated focus driven by efforts, the conscious awareness, that is, by the volition of the self, the degree of activity within the organic correlates of the intrusive pathway could be facilitated, ideally, to the end of gleaning insight into the nature of the disturbance in the night. The free period had seeped away during the culmination of these thoughts, and now a regular mob of undergraduates had assembled at the door to batter at it, in hopes of assistance on projects, papers, or other odds and ends within the scope of advising. The students launched into a continuous, sometimes overlapping bombardment of inquiry, which continued relentlessly until the allocated time had been depleted, then perhaps 15 minutes additional, when some excitable and long-winded prospect rambled at length regarding some unified theory of consciousness, a proposal shamelessly half-baked, and beyond all doubt largely unsubstantiated by the literature. Following this routine insurrection of the attentions, a few additional periods of lecture passed without incident, and it became clear only later that during that time, my unconscious machinery had composed the second component of the day's theory on addressing the cognitive menace. Among other items, it was within the scope of the materials which my position required I present before the students to address in great detail the mechanical workings and architecture of the human brain. A precisely orchestrated mass of lipids, liquids, pathways, and conductions of all types, from the basal transmissions of electrical pulses to the minutiae of chemical and molecular movements required to carry out that process. And undoubtedly, above all, a very tangible object, subject to the rules and regulations of physiology. Often I would strive to impart to students that it is an incredible piece of physiology, for it carries within the breadth of its function the unique ability to enact causal power over itself, facilitating the perpetual engineering of novel functions and development, while passively culling swaths of information underutilized as a matter of course. The more mundane organs of the body demonstrate no such self-modifying ability, a fact which is rather comforting to individuals enjoying the benefits of tranquil homeostasis, and most disparaging to those caught in the throttling grip of systemic dysfunction and disease. Volition itself could be argued as a function emergent from the evolution of the self-perpetuated material architecture, and it was by the intersection of this conjecture that the second principle of my attack came to be. For if the brain could reconstitute its material resources into novel configurations through a gradual, albeit continuous, process of connectivity's reiteration, surely the extraneous direction of the conscious mind operating the function of navigation for the corporeal simian creature through the tides of the material world could also serve to impart influence over this process. Thus, the notion of constructing a superior conduit was established within my own awareness.